Awesome. Well, I'm excited to be here as a part of this wonderful accelerator. As stated, my name is Terence Lester, and I'm the founder and executive director of Love Beyond Walls, which is a nonprofit organization in the city of Atlanta advocating on behalf of people experiencing homelessness and poverty, not just here in the city of Atlanta, but all around the country. I would like to start with a story. It was the middle of March in 2020 when everything I knew as a nonprofit leader was being threatened, being turned literally upside down permanently. I'll never forget, I was sitting on my couch in utter frustration, watching the news with tears in my eyes, and in total shock, hearing that the world would be shutting down. I had questions swirling around my mind, like what would become of our nonprofit organization? What about all of the volunteers? How would we be able to access hands and people, getting them involved in our critical mission? How will we navigate the rough terrain of not having enough resources because donors were pulling out in fear because of self-preservation? In that moment, I had to make a conscious decision to lean in to what we always knew was our foundation as an organization: the power of storytelling and being proximate to our beloved community. In fact, the statement that resonated with me in this moment was this: we must open ourselves up to be disrupted so we can be disruptors for change. A few days later, I'll never forget meeting my friend on the screen. His name is Dimitri, who walked through our doors at our center and literally spoke of his fear of passing away due to COVID because he wouldn't have access to wash his hands with soap and water. Yes, he was a man experiencing homelessness, but most importantly, he was my friend. That said, I thought, I will follow the cries and the concerns of those who we love and care about the most. That's when I decided to start pulling RV parts together to create what would become hand washing stations that we would place around local communities so people experiencing homelessness would have access to this critical resource of soap and water. I formulated this idea, or this storyline rather, that access to sanitation should be a human right for all, especially those who are without an address. And this is an important fact that I learned: that a story will lead you to lean in and listen. The story spread. Little did we know that it would spread and have over 2.3 trillion impressions on social media. We grew from 15 stations, hand washing stations in the city of Atlanta, to about 60 cities currently all around the United States and 2 additional countries. We inspired those to see those without homes as being a part of the whole community. You see, I learned something important: that there is real power in storytelling. Storytelling is essentially the lifeblood that fuels your mission and reminds you to keep showing up, even in moments of crisis and uncertainty. Because we had the courage to share this story and lean in, people who would otherwise be looked over for a critical resource had access. There were people washing their hands in public parks and behind buildings and underneath bridges. You see, we must realize that the power of storytelling has the ability to spread, even to inspire kids in countries and people that we would never meet. We must also keep in mind that we are living in a time where stories are everything. Stories communicate what your core values are. Stories communicate your heart. Stories communicate the things that you stand for, but most importantly, stories create and tell the story of what's constantly on our minds and hearts every single second. What was the last thing you posted on social media? Who was the last person that you invited out for a cup of coffee? What location were you all in? You see, our stories do not deserve to sit on a shelf while the world continues to suffer with all sorts of disparities and injustice. Not only does storytelling matter, effective storytelling can create change and provide real-time solutions. We were even able to see some of our indigenous friends get access to this critical resource of sanitation on the Navajo Nation reservation, which is one of my most inspiring stories. Learning that indigenous people literally had to drive an hour and a half away to get the critical resource of water and soap to bring it back on the reservation so they could wash their hands. But if we're honest, there's a tendency to get burnt out with telling the same story over and over and over again. You see, there's this real false sense of thinking that because we have shared what we stand for a lot already, that it's not needed anymore. You see, I had to learn this important truth in the middle of a pivot or in the middle of tense times as an organizational leader, that the more you tell your story, the greater chances of people actually being attracted to what you stand for. And this story can even open up new possibilities for the work that you're currently doing. You see, I had to understand that there were new people and new allies and new organizations and new individuals who never had heard what we were doing, but they were already ready and prepped and primed to be activated to do this important work on the front lines. Let me tell you something. There are people right now who are waiting to hear your story, but they can't be activated if they never hear. If you never talk about the work that you're doing, it could literally stunt the possibilities of opening up for you to expand your work. You see, to maintain the passion that you have surrounding your story, you must remember why your story exists. As a storytelling leader, I have to realize that storytelling, as much as we love it, also has to incorporate dignity in the stories that we tell of people we attempt to humanize. You see, we've seen what happens when dignity is taken away from the stories that we are telling. You see, dignity matters in all moments of story shares. That's why I decided to lean in a little more as a storytelling leader, to create what we call the Dignity Museum. I'll never forget riding down the street one day and noticing a shipping container. I climbed on top of it and had my wife take a picture, because in my mind, I knew that this container contained powerful metaphors. Every shipping container has a story of origin. Every shipping container moves around from place to place, and every shipping container literally carries things of substance and of value. But isn't that like the experience of homelessness, where people have stories of origin? They move around from place to place, but that does not mean that they don't have worth and value on the inside of them. This is when I had this idea to literally turn the shipping container into a museum that would house technology and have the ability to pass the microphone to people who would otherwise be silenced or deemed invisible. We launched this museum and gave people an opportunity to literally come in and have their myths challenged, to have the ability to understand what empathy actually does in the middle of a story that is contained with so much crisis. We've had thousands of people come through this museum, from students in elementary school to college students who are working on PhDs to law enforcement officers wanting to know how to compassionately engage their community and their neighbors. You see, when shared correctly, stories have the power to mobilize people around a cause or project that can inspire and change people's lives. I'll never forget one time having a person literally stand in a museum who was a part of the political landscape. And for the first time, this state senator turned to her colleagues and shared of her own experience of going through homelessness before she had ever even reached the level of a state senator. You see, stories are powerful because stories have the ability to communicate what it means to affirm the dignity of the members of society who we are all fighting for and wanting to see flourish. So how do we tell these stories? Well, firstly, we never share the stories of people that we've never established a relationship with inside of our community. I believe it's very essential to protect the dignity of every single person that we have established a relationship inside of our community, getting them to understand what their stories are so their stories are empowering to them, but also giving them an opportunity to decide if they want their story shared to a larger community. And what we found is once the trust is established, then the relationships itself becomes more important than using a story just to satisfy our own desires. We understand that stories have the ability to communicate in a language that helps people to understand why we need more people fighting on behalf of those who are deemed voiceless, excluded, and living on the margins of society. You know, we want to center the voices of those who have the courage to literally suffer through the hardship each and every second of their very lives and existence. And as a leader, I understand that sharing these stories can help to educate, build empathy, but also give the microphone to those persons who have been silenced. Because the more people who hear these stories and are educated, the more empathy that we can build in a world that is numb and full of apathy. You see, I believe that the first thing you must do when talking about storytelling, you've got to own your story. I believe there is power in owning your story because it gives us the empowerment to create a world where no one is invisible. It is in owning our stories and being daring enough to share our stories that actually creates the new possibilities for the work that is in front of us. You know, people actually live vicariously through the work and the stories that we tell, and that's a huge responsibility as a leader. Yeah, sure, it can be satisfying to be encouraged because people are leaning into our stories and they're living vicariously through the work that we're doing. But it's also our responsibility to ensure that the stories that we are sharing are safe and communicate messages of belonging and acceptance for those who are standing on the sidelines, begging and wanting to be seen. The second thing I think we need to do is show people that they have a role in the stories that we are telling and giving them space to actually live out that role. And this means that we must commit to not having exclusive stories that exclude the everyday person. But we must understand that everyone is needed to change the world. Every single person is needed. From the CEO to the local high school teacher who has visited students during COVID, every single role is needed and every single person matters. When was the last time you communicated your stories in a way that empowered the everyday person to believe that they could snatch the low-hanging fruit themselves and actually make a difference in the world around them? You see, stories are powerful and have the unique ability to change our world and the very nature of what we represent within our organizations and or brands. And the third and last thing is that you must tell stories that contain the 4 Ps: the person or persons, the place, the environment, the purpose, and also the plan. You see, our stories must push back against what novelist Adichie coined as the single story narrative. We've got to tell the full story. We've got to tell the full story and paint the story in a way that gives people context to the persons that we love and adore and are a part of our beloved community, the environments and the context in which these persons may exist, the purpose of our stories surrounding the exact reasons with clarity as to why we are telling these stories, and the plan, communicating a person or giving a person an opportunity to see how they can insert themselves in the much larger fabric of your story. Because in essence, we are all telling stories every single second of our lives. We're telling the stories of heritage. How did we start? What was our story of origin? We're telling the stories of change. Who is this story impacting? And why is that impact occurring? We're telling stories of struggle about how transparent we are on this road and this journey to create the type of world that we all wish to see. We're telling the stories of we. Who are we bringing together to actually create the type of change that we all desire to see? We're telling stories of involvement, about who is being mobilized, and stories of vision. Why are we doing what we are doing, and why are we doing this mission now? We're telling stories of community and what community looks like amongst the people that we choose to walk alongside. We're telling stories of belonging, about who we are including in the much larger fabric of our vision. We're also telling stories of opportunity and how we can actually get people involved. Who are the stakeholders? Who are the persons who are needed to accomplish your mission? But most importantly, we're telling stories of doing what we said we would do. And this is about the story of consistency. No matter where you may find yourself, you're continuing to show up. Because remember, the story that you tell today could actually be the story that changes the world tomorrow. Thank you.